In 1933, owning gold became a crime that shocked everyday Americans and shook private trust in the state. You are about to hear how a single signature converted private property into contraband overnight, and why that matters for modern crises. The hook is simple and unsettling because it was real and immediate, and you will feel the human consequences from the first day to the last. What seems like a strange relic of the past will unfold into a clear warning about what governments can do when panic and power meet. The Great Depression had already stripped public confidence down to its bones by 1933, and you can feel that vulnerability in every headline from the era. Banks were collapsing at a breathtaking rate, and people panicked because their life savings could vanish overnight without any legal recourse. You need to understand that gold was not simply jewelry or a collectible to Americans back then, but the backbone of monetary certainty and a refuge from failing institutions. Imagine losing faith in paper money and then having your safe haven declared illegal by the very government promising stability. As banks failed and depositors rushed to withdraw cash, the economy slid deeper into deflation and despair, and you can hear that desperation in personal letters from the time. People hoarded gold because gold held value when currencies were collapsing, and trusting banks felt like gambling with life savings. Officials feared that hoarding gold would paralyze credit and prevent the Federal Reserve from expanding the money supply when expansion mattered most. That fear set the stage for a radical policy move that would reach into private homes and private safes. On the 5th of April 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102 amid rumors and panic, and you can imagine the urgency behind that inked document. The order made it illegal for most Americans to own gold coins, bullion, or certificates, requiring surrender by May 1st of that year. This was not a gentle suggestion, but a federal command with teeth. And you should picture the sudden shift in legal reality for millions of citizens. For people who had placed their faith in gold, that looming surrender date compressed time into a panic unlike anything before. The price the government offered was $20.67 per troy ounce, and you should remember that number because it becomes the fulcrum of an economic transfer. Citizens were ordered to deliver their gold to Federal Reserve banks, and were told the government would pay that fixed price in dollars. What you must grasp is how that fixed price interacted with events to come. Because the government shortly altered the monetary ground under everyone involved. The immediate calculus made the surrender look like a routine monetary conversion, but appearances were deceptive. But here is where it gets interesting, and where the headline shock turns into a tangible transfer of wealth that changed hands overnight. In January 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, which revalued the dollar in gold terms and set the official price at $35 per troy ounce. You can do the math in your head and feel the unfairness. The government had collected gold at the old price and then declared the new price higher, effectively granting itself a huge gain. What happened next will shock you because it was not a small bookkeeping tweak, but a profit of roughly 69% on the confiscated metal. You might think that such a transfer would have been loudly contested in courts or on the streets, but the context muted pushback in powerful ways. The nation was in crisis, and the administration framed the move as necessary for devaluation, inflation control, and economic recovery that would benefit millions. That framing mattered because people were willing to accept extraordinary measures when the promise of relief hung in the balance, and the court of public opinion often bows to the narrative of necessity in moments of emergency. Still, resentment and suspicion simmered beneath surface acquiescence. Enforcement was not theoretical, it was backed by criminal penalties and real consequences for ignoring the order, and you can imagine the weight of federal law closing in on private citizens. Violating the order carried penalties up to 10 years in prison or a $10,000 fine. And those sanctions were intended to deter concealment. The threat of severe punishment made compliance a clear risk calculus for ordinary owners, and the government used that deterrence to ensure a high surrender rate. Yet punishment alone did not eliminate resistance, and some citizens defied the order in quiet, inventive ways. Some people obeyed reluctantly and handed over family heirlooms because they feared imprisonment and social chaos more than the loss itself. And you should think of those decisions as survival choices. Others stashed their gold beneath floorboards, behind bricks, and in far-flung hiding places, trusting memory and secrecy over legal safety. There were tales of hoards to this day, and you can feel the irony of families keeping quiet treasures that remained legally condemned but morally cherished. The human instinct to hide value when the state demands it created a small underground economy of avoidance and secrecy. Others attempted to move their gold beyond American jurisdiction, shipping bullion to foreign vaults or exchanging it for something less conspicuous. And you can see how global networks absorbed the shock. Switzerland, for instance, long seen as a safe harbor for precious metals, saw increased activity from worried Americans. These cross-border movements reveal how national policies can have international ripple effects, and you should recognize that capital seeks shelter when laws shift abruptly. The government was aware of these outflows and tightened rules to try to limit international escape routes. Exemptions in the law were limited but meaningful, and you need to know who could keep some gold even as most citizens could not. Collectible rare coins, certain industrial uses, and dental gold were explicitly exempted, and those exceptions created odd disparities in who retained wealth. You might find it surreal that a dentist could legally keep gold used for fillings, while a farmer could not keep his wedding coins, and such inconsistencies amplified perceptions of unfairness. Exemptions became a window into the complex political bargaining that often colors sweeping emergency policies. What makes this episode historically significant is not only the seizure itself, but the precedent it established about property and emergency power, and you should consider how chilling that precedent can be. The government exercised a power to convert private holdings into public reserves, and that choice was normalized through law and executive force. You must appreciate how the language of necessity can legalize actions that would be unthinkable in calmer times, and that slippery slope speaks directly to contemporary anxieties about state overreach. If the state can claim your gold for a crisis, what else might it claim under different pretexts? The financial math of the policy produced an immediate profit for the government, and you can call that transfer a quiet expropriation of private value. By buying gold at $20.67 and later declaring its official value at $35 per ounce, the United States effectively realized an immediate gain of roughly 69% on seized metal. That profit did not escape notice among contemporaries and historians alike, and you should ask whether the economic benefit was an intended policy lever or a consequential windfall. Either explanation carries ethical implications that still reverberate through debates about fairness and public necessity. What happened next will shock you because the policy lasted far longer than most Americans remember, and you should recognize that legal reversals often move slowly, although Executive Order 6102 required surrender in 1933. Restrictions on private gold ownership remained in force until 1974, when President Gerald Ford signed legislation reversing the ban. That long arc means generations grew up believing gold had been essentially nationalized for a time. And you can see how laws persist in cultural memory even after they are repealed. The delayed repeal also highlights how temporary measures can ossify into decades of practice. You should also consider the legal theater that accompanied these policies, because the courts were not an immediate refuge for objecting citizens who sought to challenge the government's authority. Several lawsuits were brought against the expropriation, but the courts generally upheld the executive and congressional decisions under the rubric of national emergency. The judicial deference serves as a reminder that during crises, institutional checks can contract rather than expand. And you must question the balance between swift action and constitutional safeguards when fear dominates the political atmosphere. That tension is central to understanding why the policy unfolded as it did. The human stories of resistance include inventive concealment and heartbreaking compliance, and you will encounter people who buried fortunes and others who surrendered family heirlooms with trembling hands. These personal narratives reveal moral complexity because citizens weighed the threat of legal punishment against the moral duty to preserve family wealth for future generations. You need to imagine a grandmother hiding a locket in a cookie jar rather than surrender it to a bank that might not return it. And you should imagine the silence and secrecy that these choices required. These quiet acts of defiance became a private form of protest against a public policy deemed by some as overreach. International consequences also mattered because the revaluation and confiscation influenced trade balances, foreign holdings, and the behavior of central banks abroad. And you should see the policy as part of a global monetary reordering. Nations adjusted reserves and recalibrated policies to reflect the new American price and the changed dynamics of gold as a monetary standard. This episode reminds you that domestic monetary policy does not exist in a vacuum, and that sovereign decisions have cross-border spillovers that can reshape international finance. The world watched a major power change the rules mid-game, and economic actors responded accordingly. There are ethical questions wrapped into the legal ones because seizing private property in the name of public good forces a debate between utilitarian benefit and individual rights. You should ask whether collective recovery justified the forced conversion of private wealth and whether the ends validated the means. Those moral questions do not have easy answers because the Great Depression caused genuine suffering that demanded solutions. And you must confront the uncomfortable reality that some emergency policies may bestow real public benefits while simultaneously trampling on individual liberties. You might be wondering whether the confiscation could happen again under different circumstances, and your concern is not purely hypothetical, because history shows us how quickly emergency powers can expand. Modern advocates for stronger national controls often point to crises as rationales for intensified oversight of capital and property. That logic translates into present-day debates about bail-ins, asset freezes, and regulation of digital currencies. And you need to see Executive Order 6102 as a precedent, not a historical anomaly. The policy provides a cautionary tale about the ease with which the state can reclaim private assets when it convinces itself of necessity. Speaking of modern parallels, you should consider how the conversation about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies intersects with the memory of the 1933 seizure, and the parallels are striking. Bitcoin advocates often cite gold confiscation as evidence that a decentralized, private asset is a necessary check against state expropriation and monetary manipulation. At the same time, you should remember that no asset is immune to legal environments, and states can develop tools to regulate, restrict, or compel digital assets under certain conditions. The historical lesson is that privateness depends as much on law as it does on technology. If you ask how many Americans complied, the best estimates suggest a large percentage surrendered holdings, and you should interpret that compliance as an outcome of legal pressure, economic fear, and hope for recovery. The government collected large quantities of gold into the Federal Reserve and Treasury coffers, and then used that reserve power to implement monetary policy shifts. Numbers alone cannot capture the human cost and the emotional calculus behind surrender decisions. And you must hold both the data and the stories in mind when evaluating the policy. The statistical record and personal narratives together make a fuller, more complicated picture. There were political consequences for the Roosevelt administration as well, because some critics accused the president of overreach, while others praised the decisive action. And you should consider how this debate shaped the New Deal narrative. Supporters argued the policy enabled monetary flexibility necessary for recovery, while opponents warned about the dangerous precedent set for private rights. The clash reflected deeper ideological divides about the proper relationship between state and citizen. And you can see how economic crises amplify those rifts, forcing choices that reverberate politically for years after the emergency passes. When historians examine Executive Order 6102 now, you should see both policy and symbolism intertwined in a profound way, and you must weigh efficacy against liberty. The measure arguably helped create monetary conditions that assisted economic recovery. But that benefit came at a price in individual rights and public trust. Understanding that duality helps you discern why the episode is still taught and debated, and you should regard it as a case study in the trade-offs inherent in democratic governance under stress. It forces the question, can a democracy justify confiscation for perceived greater goods? We should also note the long legal and cultural afterlife of the policy, because it shaped attitudes toward gold ownership and monetary sovereignty for decades, and you should consider that inertia when thinking about modern reforms. The ban, as repeal in 1974, did not erase memories or mistrust generated by the seizure, and cautionary tales endure across generations. Memory matters because it conditions how citizens respond to future government claims on private assets. And you must accept that historical policies cast long shadows over present debates. The echoes of 1933 continue to influence how people think about ownership, privacy, and security. So what is the takeaway you should carry from this story, and why should you care years later when the immediate crisis is long gone? The lesson is stark in times of perceived emergency. The legal power of the state expands in ways that can override individual property rights, and citizens often accept that expansion in the hope of collective recovery. Recognizing this pattern equips you to scrutinize future emergency measures with more skepticism and a deeper understanding of potential consequences. The past offers a warning and a tool for clearer civic judgment in the future. The philosophical twist is uncomfortable, but necessary because liberty and security are rarely perfectly aligned in moments of crisis. And you must decide where you stand in that tension. You can accept strong intervention as necessary for survival, or insist on inviolable property protections, even during emergencies. And both positions have moral weight. Ultimately, you should leave with the understanding that history is not a prophecy but a caution, and that preserving democratic safeguards requires active participation and constant vigilance. The story of 1933 invites you to consider how much authority you are willing to cede in the name of safety. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and keep exploring hidden corners of history with us, because the past often illuminates current dangers in surprising ways. You should share this video with someone who thinks emergency powers are harmless, and you might spark a conversation that matters for the future. Thank you for watching this deep dive into Executive Order 6102 and its implications for government power and private rights. And remember to leave your thoughts below about how we should respond to crises without surrendering essential liberties. Appendix Detail 1. The exact statutory language and timeline matter because they show how tightly the government moved from decree to collection. And you should note specifics. The order was signed the 5th of April, 1933, gave citizens until May 1, 1933 to surrender gold. And the Gold Reserve Act followed in January 1934 to revalue gold at $35 per ounce. These dates compress the sequence of events and demonstrate how fast policy cycles can move when officials claim emergency authority. Knowing the timeline helps you assess whether responses were proportionate or rushed. Appendix Detail 2, penalties and exemptions created a patchwork of compliance, and you should pay attention to the legal specifics when evaluating fairness. The law imposed up to 10 years imprisonment or a $10,000 fine for violators, while exceptions existed for coins considered rare, certain industrial uses, and dental gold. That combination of strict penalties and narrow exemptions produced outcomes that felt arbitrary to many, and you should weigh how legal nuance can compound perceptions of injustice. The rules mattered as much as the intentions. Appendix Detail 3. Resistance came in many forms and left traces in personal stories, and you should consider those human testimonies when judging history. Some Americans buried gold under floorboards, hid coins in cookie jars, or shipped bullion overseas, and those acts of concealment demonstrate private agency under constraint. The existence of hidden hoards and foreign deposits suggests that policy compliance was never absolute, and that individual choices can blunt even powerful state efforts. These quiet resistances are part of the larger narrative about citizens navigating authoritarian measures within democratic contexts. Appendix Conclusion. The seizure of gold in 1933 remains a powerful case study in the trade-offs of emergency policy making, and you should use it to inform your own judgments about current and future crises. The balance between national recovery and personal liberty will always be contested, and the record warns against unexamined surrender of essential rights. Keep the story of Executive Order 6102 as a cautionary tale in your civic memory, and let it remind you that vigilance, debate, and legal safeguards matter even under pressure. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe.